Yeah, so we can download this afterwards on our YouTube channel. Okay, so maybe we are good to start. So hello everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's panel discussion on the vegetarian by Hangang, and in general we will talk about Hangang works and influence, because she sparked quite a big conversation across the literary and cultural world recently, because of the Nobel Prize she got. So Hangang is one of the South Korea's most celebrated writers, authors, known for her very lyrical writing and the topics that she talks about in her books about human psyche and society. She achieved global recognition when she won the Nobel Prize in Literature a few months ago, 2 months ago, and but before she was known in a literary award for winning the Man Booker International Prize in 2016 for the book that we're going to talk about today. It's a vegetarian. Um, yeah, the vegetarian. It's a novel that captured the attention of readers and critics with its very gripping exploration of rebellion, autonomy, and societal expectations. It's a story about Yong Hee, a woman who chooses to stop eating meat, which unfolds into a complex narrative about identity, trauma, and resistance, making it cornerstone about for the discussion about feminism, mental health, and cultural conformity. Hangang's has broader body of works, including Human Acts. It's Sonyeonye Onda in Korean, and the White Book, her recent work, which continues to push the boundaries of storytelling and human introspection. So today we are joined by the friends of EdHuman. Okay. Who are going to tell us about the Hangang's works and the vegetarian more deeply and with more expertise. Yeah. So welcome MK An. She's a writer and professor of literature. Her writing has been published in Fence, Korea Anthology of Korean American Fiction, Noon Annual, and has won awards from the Jerome Foundation, the M. Night Foundation, and the Love Literary Center. She also made films that have been screened internationally, and she's currently based in Seoul, Korea, and she teaches at Ewha Women's University. She's a professor of American literature. Uh-huh.
Hi, everybody.
Yeah. Oh, hello. Nilesh Kumar is from England, of Gujarati Indian background, and he resides in Seoul. He's a film curator and co-founder of the Seoul-based underground movable cinema, Stake Film and Stake Cinema. And he's completing his master degree in Korean studies at Yonsei University, also here in Seoul. His portfolio features a diverse range of works, including creating an exhibition commemorating the 100th anniversary of Korean cinema, research on post-1960s South Korean industrialization for the Korean Pavilion at the 16th Venice Architecture Biennale, and articles on film for the Canadian Film Centre. In 2023, he created an exhibition at cinema galleries in Brussels on the modern South Korean classic film Old Boy by Park Chan-wook. Okay. I think, yeah. So yeah, that was the introduction. And me myself, my name is Michil. I'm the founder of EdHuman. Yeah, and today I will try to manage the discussion with our guests. Okay, so as I said previously, you can ask the questions, join the conversation by asking the questions. You can send your questions in the chat. So our panelists can answer them either right away, or we will answer your questions at the end of the discussion. Okay, so now I think I can pass the word to our guests.
Sure. Okay. So as you can see, the slide in front of you, that's Han Kang, and you've probably read a lot about her. She's been in the news a lot over the last couple of months with the Nobel Peace Prize of Literature Award. And yeah, Mitch has given us a good introduction to her. Could you go to the next slide, please, Mitch? Yep. And that's The Vegetarian. Has anyone here read The Vegetarian? Yeah, you can see a couple of
Yes,
hands
I
going up.
read.
You read
I read
yeah.
several years ago.
I see. Was it translated into Russian, or did you read it in another language?
In Russian.
In Russian, oh great. Yeah, it's been translated, I think, into like 13 languages actually. So it's been very popular. Yeah. So with MK and I, when we were talking, meeting and talking about, what aspect of the vegetarian do we want to focus on? There were a few aspects, but we needed to round it down. So we found a very good, insightful academic paper, which was talking about Hwabyeong. And there's Hwabyeong is if it's on the next slide actually. Mitch, could you move to the next slide? Oh, by the way, this image, it shows Han Kang on the right, the writer of The Vegetarian, and then on the left is Debbie Smith, and she's the lady that she's from England. She translated The Vegetarian, and it was released in 2015, and then in 2016, as you can see in the background, it won the Man Booker International Prize. And then later, Debbie Smith went on to translate a couple of more books also by Han Kang as well. Oh, sorry, Mitch, the slides have disappeared. I think Mitch has disappeared.
He's disappeared.
Because I can't, he has other things to do.
I can just add a little bit. One interesting thing about The Vegetarian prior to it being translated and winning the Booker Prize, it had only sold 20,000 copies in Korea. So it wasn't very well known, although she was very critically acclaimed, I think, in Korea. She wasn't selling very many books until after she won the Man Booker Prize in 2016.
Right. That's a good point. Yeah. And also, just a couple of days ago, Debbie Smith has an interview with some press. She's just written something recently about her translation of The Vegetarian, and I'm just reading this from the article. She said, Debbie Smith said, when The Vegetarian was first published in Korea in 2007, it occupied the fringes of mainstream recognition, largely dismissed by the male-dominated literary establishment as too extreme and bizarre. So, that's an interesting kind of reception it got back in 2017 to the Korean audience. And of course, later in 2016, after the Man Booker International Prize, internationally, it got a lot of praise. So quite two different types of reception between the Korean version and the international version. Okay. I'll thank Mitch, and can we move on to the next slide, please? Thanks. So these are some of the keywords we'll be kind of focusing on in today's talk. The first one is Hwabyeong, which will explain what that is. Gender, sexuality, subjectivity, patriarchy, agency, rebellion, depression, anger, freedom, suffocation, colonized consciousness, decolonization, Han, which we'll go into more later, identity, brainwashing, repression, the other, and intersectionality. So these are some of the key things we'll be focusing on. Well, the main thing is Hwabyeong, sorry, my pronunciation, Hwabyeong. And basically, sorry, can you just go back? Yeah, sorry. Mitch, just go back one slide.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, so basically, Hwa, the first word, basically means anger in Korean. And byung is translated into disease. So the literal translation of Hwabyeong is anger disease. And from the academic paper that we found, we took a short excerpt from there to give you a bit more insight into what it is. So yeah, the next slide, please, Mitch. Yeah. So yeah, what is Hwabyeong? Yeah, so Hwabyeong is known as a Korean culturally bound syndrome, situated at the intersection of depression and anger, translated as anger illness or fire illness. Hwabyeong is a mental illness resulted from repressed feelings in middle-aged Korean women. And this is from the writer of the academic paper, who wrote it in Romania, Diana Leona Buduenu. Apologies if I'm not pronouncing your name correctly. Yeah, so she wrote that it's also men, Korean men have also suffered from this syndrome, this disease as well. But generally, it tends to be Korean women more often, especially middle-aged women as well. She said the first record of it being written was in the 1700s and early 1800s of a prince in Korea that had been suffering from this. And we won't go into too much detail about the academic paper, the specifics, but this writer, Diana, she wrote her paper on Hwabyeong, looking at two modern books. The first is The Vegetarian by Kang, and the second one is the Kim Ji-young, born in 1982. And both books have been international big sellers. The Vegetarian in 2015, 1 year later, Kim Ji-young, born in 1982, in 2016, became also a big seller as well. And Diana, she sees a similarity in the main characters of the two books, of them suffering from Hwabyeong. It's not clearly referred to. It's not referred to as Hwabyeong at all in the two novels. However, based on her translation of this, it appears that they both characters suffer from Hwabyeong. MK, is there anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, so I was just going to add that the specific physical symptoms or manifestations of Hwabyeong are lump in the throat or chest, feeling of suffocation, palpitations, heat sensation, burning feelings in the stomach, and insomnia. And so this author of the academic article was looking for these specific symptoms that are shown in the two main characters of these two novels.
Right. And actually, there's an excerpt from The Vegetarian in one of the slides on the topic of Hwabyeong. So, Mitch, if you can just go to the slide which has an excerpt of Hwabyeong. Not that one, keep going. Yeah, this one. Right. Yeah, so this is from The Vegetarian. I'll just read it, and it gives you an idea of the connection of Hwabyeong to the main character of The Vegetarian. So I don't know why that woman is crying. I don't know why she keeps staring at my face either, as though she wants to swallow it, or why she strokes the bandage on my wrist with her trembling hands. My wrist is okay. It doesn't bother me. The thinking, I think this is misspelled. The thinking and thrust is in my chest. Something is stuck in my solar plexus. I don't know what it might be. It's lodged there permanently these days. Even though I've stopped wearing a bra, I can feel this lump all the time. No matter how deeply I inhale, it doesn't go away. Yells and howls threaded together, layer upon layer, are enmeshed to form the lump. Because of meat. Anyway, we won't go into the rest. But anyway, this gives you an idea of, the medical description tying in with the main character description as well. Yeah, going back. Super. Does anyone have any questions so far or comments regarding Hwabyeong?
So I can just add a little bit. If we go back to that passage, we can see that, she has some of these physical symptoms of Hwabyeong. And if we look at that last paragraph, it's something that she really wants to remove from her body. So I want to shout, I want to throw myself through the pitch black window. Maybe that would finally get this lump out of my body. Perhaps that might work. Nobody can help me, nobody can save me, nobody can make me breathe. So it's something that she wouldn't know what it was, right? It's just a feeling that she's having, and because it's not necessarily something that could be easily diagnosed, I think, in the medical field, especially if she's being looked at in the frame of a mental illness, right? That it wouldn't be looked at in this way. So I think that she feels very isolated and very alone and very much by herself, like she needs to figure this out by herself, because as we see in the opening pages of the novel, which are from the point of view of her husband, we can see very clearly how he's treating her and how he's looking at her simply as a crazy person by her behavior and her decision not to eat meat suddenly. So that's another thing that's interesting about the novel, is that we never really get Young-hae, the protagonist, we never get her point of view. It's always the husband's point of view, and then the brother-in-law's point of view, and then her sister's point of view. And so I think maybe Nilesh has more to paint for us in terms of point of view.
Also, MK, the question is like, from the paper we read, it's saying it's a specifically Korean syndrome, right? It's Korean, and more specifically, the majority of the people who have Hwabyeong are women, not men as well. So I think the question is like, why is it Korean specific, and why is it Korean women specific as well, right?
Yeah, when we were talking, I think that you can't help but go through Korean history and the decades and decades of colonization that Korea suffered in the past by China and Japan. So I really read some of the symptoms and just the manifestations of this physicality on the women's body, in particular, women's body and mind, from those years and years of oppression and manifested in repression, particularly when we look at females and females in a patriarchal society of Korea, but then also colonized by China and Japan at the same time. And that for women in particular, there would be no platform, there would be no way to express their anger or their frustration. There would be no way to express any of their feelings really, truly in that patriarchal society. So we see that very clearly from the first chapter, from the point of view of the husband, that as we know, obviously the Korean women's place is very much in the domestic sphere. It's very limited there. it's changed, but still, even when women are working outside of the home now, they are responsible for everything that goes on inside of the home domestically. And so the pressure is compounded, right, onto women that they have to manage all of these things if they want to have a career outside of the home. So that builds up, and if there is no platform for expression, if there is no way for them to vent or express any of these feelings, then it can manifest in the body as an illness, as a disease.
Right, absolutely, yeah, and also like just to add on to that, I mean, of course, like with the younger generation and young women, I think the culture is changing and things are changing. But I mean, to add on to what MK said, if we look back at like why is the culture like this, and Confucianism, has been one of the reasons as well. The philosophy of Confucianism originating from China is still quite predominant in South Korea, and one of the aspects of that is hierarchy. So older people coming before younger people, or respect older people, the differences between men and women. And historically, even if we look at, for example, architecture, if we look at the architectural space in traditional Korean society with hanok, traditional Korean homes, men's quarters would have been out on the external part of the house for them to socialize with people, be able to have a study to educate themselves and other people. And women's quarters were always inside, called anbang, always inside the structure of the hanok, the house system, for them to focus more on internal home activities as well. So, even in the traditional architectural space that was there, and yeah, even through modern times, that has still predominance. So as MK said, as you said, MK, yeah, there's a certain repression, right? Unfortunately, that has been with women, in Korean women, unfortunately, for probably hundreds of years, actually, and has not fully disappeared, of course. And also MK mentioned about colonization. As many of you know, like South Korea was colonized from 1910 to 45 by the Japanese, and then almost immediately after, the Americans and Russians settled in, and divided the country. But just kind of studying Korean film, Korean cinema, and Korean literature, and a recurring aspect is the colonization of Korea itself. We can view it as a feminization of the land, of Korea as a country. Outsiders such as the Japanese colonizers or American military coming in as kind of a masculine entity, taking power over the feminine body of the Korean land. And at the same time, if you study Korean cinema, Korean literature more, there's a link to the emasculation of Korean men historically, especially if we look at 1910 onwards, even through the 1980s and 1990s. Korean men feeling that they've lost power to either the colonizers, the Japanese colonizers, to the American military later, and later losing power to those in hierarchy, even those Koreans who have higher power, such as bosses in companies, leaders of the country. And so this emasculation can then lead to, if Korean men feel they have lost power and feel emasculated, then what is a way to gain power? And often a simple and easy solution is to assert that power on women, whether it's sexually or emotionally, physical violence, for example. And this theme has been very recurrent if we analyze Korean cinema and Korean literature, definitely from the 1910s onwards through the decades as well. So this is kind of a little bit of insight into the kind of cultural background of Hwabyeong and why it's Korean specific and why Korean female specific as well. Yeah. And MK, maybe it's good time to kind of mention about certain points of inequality women face now, I mean, or these days?
Yeah, well, I'm going to go back to your point about emasculation first. I think that that was a really
Sure.
good point to make. And
Mm.
some of the results or some of the impacts on the country are kind of toxic masculinity, I think, because of men feeling the loss of power and control in a national sense, right? So then that can manifest in the household because the expression of that kind of anger and toxic masculinity is usually going to happen to the people closest to them, so family members, partners, wives, children. So we see a lot of abuse, both emotional and physical abuse, as a result of this. And so sometimes we can think, you know, a character like Young-hae, she's contemporary, right? And we can say, well, she seems sort of far away from those colonial times, but we have seen evidence of sort of this trauma, right, of the colonized consciousness, let's say, that builds up over time, and it does become programmed in one's DNA. And so it can be passed on through the generations, right, if the cycle is not stopped, if those deep brainwashing and colonized consciousness psychologically is not examined and processed, it can remain in one's DNA. So yes, in today's society, though, women have made some strides and some movement forward in terms of equality. It still is very much unequal. And so we're seeing that very much in women's refusal these days to get married, because they kind of know what most men are going to expect and want in that marriage, and that they would rather have their own careers. So that might be a step forward, but we also see that in the plummeting birth rate, that women are refusing to engage in reproductive labor. I think they're seeing that sort of in this Marxist frame. Well, this is labor on my part that is not, I'm not being rewarded for that, right? Because I have to assume all the responsibilities of childcare in the domestic sphere. So again, these all compound on each other to really impact women negatively, right, in terms of the access that they have to their own careers or their own independence, and the access that they have to mental health and really healthy expression of their feelings and their emotions.
Right. And also, MK, I mean, to what you've mentioned about the low birth rate and, you know, refusal to get married, it makes me think of the, you know, the 4B movement, right, which has become very big internationally in terms of the news, especially after Trump's election in the USA quite recently as well. So I don't know if anyone's read about the 4B movement. It started in South Korea many years ago, but just more recently, maybe in the last month or so, it has become bigger news internationally in the UK and USA, for example. And there are 4 Bs, as in do not do. So the first one is do not date, as in Korean women not to date men. The second one is do not get married. The third one is do not have sex. And the fourth one is do not have children with men. So these are the 4 Bs. If you Google that, you'll be able to find many articles and YouTube videos about that. And of course, it's probably the minority of kind of feminist women in South Korea who are practicing this. But even if it's the minority, it says a lot about the culture and you know, refusal of women to be dominated in a patriarchal society. And how do they refuse this? You know, and the 4B movement is one aspect of refusal. And, you know, refusal is something we will come back to later, I think, MK, right, regarding the vegetarian. Because, you know, the main character, Young-hae, refusal is one of the keywords. She refuses to eat meat. And then later she refuses to also eat food, actually, as well. So it's a refusal to many things, to the patriarchal society, to expectations as well. And the 4B movement is a refusal to, you know, this as well. And before we kind of move on as well, like regarding MK, like regarding what the topic of why Korea, why Korean women with Hwabyeong as well. I have a couple of statistics here that I got from kind of, the book came out in 2015 in English, right? The Vegetarian. And if we look at the kind of statistics from then to now, statistically, the first one is that more than 50% of all homicide victims are women. It's one of the highest rates in South Korea of female murder in the world. So female murder in South Korea is one of the highest in the world, unfortunately, including domestic abuse between boyfriends, girlfriends, husbands, wives. And it wasn't until 2013 that the South Korean government convicted the husband of spousal rape. So it happened quite recently in that way. In 2020, it was legal for women, girls to have consensual sex to the age of 13, which is a very low age. But in 2020, they increased it to 16. In 2020, in OECD countries, South Korea had the largest gap regarding the salary gap between men and women. So it was the largest gap in OECD countries in 2020, so quite recently. And then finally, if we look at women in law and business, there are less than 40% of Korean women in top executive positions. Within law, just 30% of women are judges. And if we look at police women, less than 4% of the police force are women. So, just thinking about positions of power in South Korea, whether it's business, law, and the police, the percentages are very low of South Korean women having power in that. So, statistically, power is an issue, unfortunately, that some or many South Korean women have to deal with, either overtly or inadvertently as well. So hopefully this kind of information shines light on why Hwabyeong in Korea, why Hwabyeong on South Korean women. So yeah, MK, is there anything you would like to add, or should we move on to the next part?
I think we can move on.
Sure. So MK had mentioned earlier, what we both found unique about The Vegetarian is it's divided into 3 sections, and in the first section, it's from the Young Hae's husband's perspective. The second section is from Young Hae's brother-in-law's perspective, and the final third section is from the perspective of her sister. So the majority of the book, if not the whole book, almost the whole book, it's actually not from Young Hae's perspective at all. So, which is very interesting, the way that the book is written, it's other people observing her, other people talking about her, writing about her. Young Hae, the main character, doesn't really have her own voice in this book, even though she's the main character in this, So it says a lot, so we talk about the repression of women, and Young Hae being a representation of that in South Korean culture. But even though, what is smart about the writer Han Kang is, even the way it's written, there's repression in the way that the book is written itself, And MK and I, a week ago when we met, right, and talked about this, we mentioned how it's almost as if Young Hae is a piece of art in this novel. She's the character. She's the piece of art that has been created by Han Kang, or in a macro way, South Korean society. And the people who are kind of analyzing the art, or even creating the art, are her husband, her brother-in-law, and later her sister as well. So, the people who are creating the art, the people who are analyzing the art, they are external people, which leaves the main character, Young Hae, having no voice, having no subjectivity in that way. actually, pacifying her even more. Something to be analyzed, something to be looked at, criticized, and judged.
Yeah, so I think it's a really interesting choice of point of view from Hangang for the novel. And it's really where the form of the novel is informing the content or letting us know more about the content, right? And Young-hae does have some passages where it's her point of view. It's in the italicized version. And it's usually having to do with this dream that has sparked her, triggered her desire to stop eating meat and to become a vegetarian. It's a dream that recurs and that she doesn't even understand. And so that's where the novel opens, is when the husband wakes up to find that she's throwing out all the meat from the refrigerator, and he doesn't understand why. So he just keeps saying these things. If we go through to the next slides, that I think he just keeps saying that she's crazy. Yeah, well, this is just about her being, very unremarkable, just a very average woman who he really prefers. But this is some of his reactions. What the hell are you up to now? I shouted, and this is what she was doing, taking out all of the meat. And then again, have you lost your mind? Why on earth are you throwing all of this stuff out? So I think it's really trying to show that more patriarchal, kind of angry point of view, and just the assumption that his wife has gone crazy, and her not having a voice about that, or her just being in this frame of somebody who's mentally ill without taking anything in context. So she tries to explain to her husband about a dream, but he doesn't care about a dream. He doesn't really want to hear that. All he can understand is what he sees and what he hears. He doesn't go much deeper into trying to understand what her position or what her motivations might be.
Right. I think MK, is it in an earlier slide? He actually, the husband, he talks about his expectation of Young-hae to like wake up early, make breakfast, and make. Oh, this is it, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So it says, in keeping with this is the husband, in keeping with my expectations, she made for a completely ordinary wife who went about things without any distasteful frivolousness. Every morning, she got up at 6 a.m. to prepare rice and soup, and usually a bit of fish. From adolescence, she contributed to her family's income through the odd bit of part-time work. I think it continues, Mitch, maybe on the next page. Let's just check.
Yeah.
Or maybe not, yeah. But
I think in the next one, yeah, this one. Mm-hmm.
Right.
Not once did my wife bother to peer out from the kitchen in the time it took me to get ready, slinging my tie around my neck like a scarf, pulling on my socks and getting my notebook and wallet together. In the 5 years we'd been married, this was the first time I'd had to go to work without her handing me my things and seeing me off. So that's his expectation of her behavior.
Mm-hmm. Which is a very stereotypical, South Korean husband expectation for the woman to wake up early and prepare breakfast before her husband goes to the office or to work, prepare clothes for him, make sure the clothes are well ironed and clean. A good housewife, basically, yeah. So it's a very stereotypical kind of perspective here. I think also, MK, if I can add in something as well, if we kind of look at the, oh wait, just go back, Mitch, please, last one. Yeah, if we look at, thank you. If we look at the kind of the social, the social atmosphere of when The Vegetarian came out, we know the Korean version came out in 2007, the English version 2015, and then 2016. But what is important is the other book we mentioned, Kim Ji-young, born in 1982, which is a modern feminist classic, I strongly recommend reading it or watching the film if you haven't done so already. So 2015, 2016 was a key year for The Vegetarian internationally. 2016, Kim Ji-young, born in 1982, was released. Early 2018, the Me Too movement started in South Korea when, one female prosecutor came out, voiced her frustrations publicly about some sexual assault she had experienced. And then after her, in 2018 and 19, many more South Korean women started to come out, with, accusations towards men who had raped them or sexually abused them, So, this time frame, there was a lot of things happening. And, this book, The Vegetarian, sits very well into this time frame of South Korean women really starting to rebel and really starting to question, hold on, why should we be hiding abuse against us? Why should we be living in this patriarchal society, And there was also, around the Me Too movement, before or after, there was also a no corset movement, where some South Korean women basically refused to wear makeup. Because often it was a strong expectation for, especially women, white-collar women, when they go to offices, to look good, to have on the right makeup and look very feminine. Also for job interviews and even the photos on their resumes, on their CVs. And, some women who are part of the no corset movement, they said, well, why should we wear makeup and try to please men, try to please our male colleagues, So there was a movement of some South Korean women not wearing makeup anymore, refusing that patriarchal side of society. There are, some South Korean who even started shaving their hair in public or shaving their hair alone at home, but publicizing it on Instagram through video or publicizing it on YouTube as well. So, this period of The Vegetarian, Kim Ji-young, born in 1982, brought about also the Me Too movement, the No Closet movement, and we see a rebellion against patriarchy, a refusal. And Young-hae is a good example of this, right? A good example of this, right, MK?
Yeah. Yeah, so if we go to that slide that starts with Dark Woods, I think that is the beginning of her dream. And if we look at dreams as something coming from our deep unconscious, right, we can kind of link this maybe to what I was talking about colonized consciousness, because this kind of consciousness would be something that's very much unconscious in many ways. And so these things can manifest themselves in dreams. And in this case, Young-hae is obviously remembering this dream, and it's quite abstract in some way, but it's very specific with meat. And so this really starts or stimulates, triggers her refusal of the meat, because she thinks that this is somehow responsible for her feelings of suffocation and this lump in her throat, or something is in her body and she feels like she needs to remove it. So it's kind of like a psychosomatic sort of bodily sensation that she's having. And these images are very vivid and, very brutal in some ways, very violent. So it's speaking to, for me anyway, like, a lot about the colonial past.
Right. Yeah, very good point. Yeah. And honestly, MK, I mean, yeah, meat is a recurring thing, right? From Young-hae throughout the book in terms of her dreams and talking about her dreams, and I think if we just kind of like look at what is meat and what does it represent potentially in this context as well, I mean, first of all, like, I think just looking at the core of meat, I mean, most countries, most societies in the world, we don't animals are not naturally born, right? Animals are pigs, cows, chickens. Mostly, they're born in a slaughterhouse. From when they're chicks and small babies, they are born into a slaughterhouse, and they are raised to be slaughtered, right? So from the minute they are born, actually, they are born with no freedom. They are born in a cage in most countries around the world. And secondly, when they are slaughtered, when we see videos of cows being slaughtered or even milk cows, there's a lot of pain, there's a lot of suffering occurring in their life and also in the death process as well. And then as a result of that, as human beings, we are eating this pain, right? The pain, in a way, the pain that the animal has lived through its life, and then the final pain that the animal unfortunately has upon its death. We eat that. We eat that pain. We eat that shame. There are many negative emotions that we are, in a way, digesting and putting into our stomach. So in a very literal way, we can talk about meat and the relationship of meat in this literal way, I think, to the novel. Whereas more metaphorically, if we see meat as representations of guilt, pain, shame, violence, right? I think the writer of the article also mentioned that as well. And in that way, Young-hae, the main character, she's really referring to the violence in her body, right? The violence and the pain, the shame and the guilt in her body. And does this violence, does this pain, guilt and shame, does it arise from the society that she's from, right? Maybe from her husband, from her parents, from her society as well. So I think the aspect of meat has a lot of, there's a lot we can say about the reference to meat, right?
Yeah. I think that there's a question from
there was
Alex.
someone posted something in the chat.
Alex S. If you want to ask the question using your voice, you can do that. Just turn on the mic.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, it's just I'm in a cafe and it's pretty loud, so I was worried that I would disturb you. That's why I was writing my question. And just I read the book like quite a few years ago, and I don't have very detailed recollections from it. But the aftertaste of was pretty like dark and depressing and kind of suffocating, as I think you mentioned that word. And I was just wondering if you can find anything like more life affirming in the book, and what would that be? Or it would be just more like the book was praised for raising, the very important questions like masculinity, or I mean like the patriarchy, the decolonization, the rebel, like those kind of very important phenomena. Or there was something that I missed in the book, and maybe I couldn't understand that. So I was just wondering if you could find something like that, kind of considering your rich expertise. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Alex, for the question. Really, really good and valid question there. And yeah, I think I definitely felt the same when I read the book as well. Like quite dark and saddening, unfortunately. MK, when we talked about this aspect, like, is there any light in this book? Is there any hope in this book? MK, shall we come to this question later? Because it's kind of towards the later in our discussion, right? Or do you want to raise it now?
Yeah, we can do like a little preview, because actually it was what I was going to talk about after your comments about this dream section and about meat and the symbolic nature of the meat in the novel. And that is that usually if a woman in Korean society would have this kind of a dream, right, she would keep it to herself. She wouldn't say anything about it. She would just repress it because it would seem too crazy, and she doesn't want to get into trouble, or she doesn't want to create conflict. She would try to deal with it on her own. But what's interesting is that Young-hae, she can't keep it to herself, right? And we don't really know why. But in a way, she's finding her platform for expression. She's choosing to refuse. She's choosing to rebel by not eating meat, which is a really big statement in Korean society because most people eat meat. And if you don't eat meat, you're seen as going against the grain and kind of a problem. Like, why can't you eat meat just like everybody else? You have to conform, you have to comply, right? So she is beginning to make these efforts to step out and to refuse and to rebel. I think that that is really positive, even though it's really brutal and her father tries to force her by being very violent with her to eat meat, right? And so later we'll get into kind of what that symbolizes, but I think that it is the beginning process, if we're looking at this in a post-colonial frame, in the decolonization, right? If we can process through some of the oppression and repression that has been compounded over the years, we have to make these efforts to refuse, to rebel, to say no, to say, this is what I need to express. And no matter how violent or how tragic this expression is, this is the start. We have to start somewhere. And so I think that there's so many layers that compound and build up over time. And this is the beginning of it for Young-hae.
Right, right. And I think that's a really good point, MK, about the meat part as well, because I mean now, I've lived in Seoul for many, many years, and MK has as well. And now in Seoul we have a lot of vegan and vegetarian restaurants. Not that Korean people are becoming vegetarian or vegan, it's just kind of a well-being or health trend. But that's quite recently, I'd say in the last 4 years or something. But up until then, like often when I told Korean people, oh, I'm vegetarian, they would look at me like I was crazy. Like, why are you vegetarian? If you don't eat meat, how can you be healthy? Where do you get your protein from? So I always have to give answers and like an explanation, etc. Which is okay. It's a cultural difference, And secondly, regarding meat as a cultural thing in South Korea, South Korea was very, very poor, especially after the Korean War. So people couldn't easily obtain meat, and so even now, to be able to eat steak and to eat meat, it's seen as a sign of health and also status symbol as well, that you have some amount of wealth. If you go to Starbucks, all of their sandwiches will have meat in there. If you go to a convenience store, all the sandwiches and snacks like gimbap, all of them will have meat or fish in there. So it's a very meat and fish. It's a very integral part of even contemporary like South Korean culture. And so to refuse that, especially then, I'd say like 2016, 15, and before that, it was even stronger against the cultural norm as well. Samgyeopsal, yes. Exactly, yeah, grilled Korean grilled pork. Yeah, exactly, very popular here as well. So yeah, I agree with MK. But Alex, does that answer part of your question?
Oh yeah, thank you. It's I like that point of view. Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah.
And then I also just kind of I remembered vaguely remembered the ending part of the book, and I was wondering what that ending would mean.
Yeah.
Because I think that at that point it looked very desperate, and I felt like there was no way out for her, for the character, or something like that. So I don't know whether maybe I misunderstood the ending, or yeah. So I just wanted to ask that too, if there's time. Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's not really about misunderstanding the ending. I mean, novels, right? They're all a piece of art, right? And at the end of the day, art is how do you interpret it, right? And potentially how do you personalize it when you see art as well, whether it's literature or film or paintings, you know. And this topic, you know, Alex, you've mentioned the final chapter with her sister, which is really interesting. And MK, shall we come to that later, or do you want to
Yeah.
come to it
Although
later?
I will say that I think the novel, sorry, the ending is very positive in its tragedy. Okay, so we'll kind of get to that in the end. But
Yeah.
again, you know, sometimes certain things have to be sacrificed in order for progress to be made or advancements to be made, unfortunately. Right? So, but I view the ending as very positive. Mhm.
Right,
Yeah.
right. So we'll come to that soon.
Yeah, we'll come back to that.
Right. MK, shall we move on to the second part, the second chapter about Mongolian mark?
Yeah, the first part, you know, it goes through this whole scene with the family and the father being very violent and brutal towards Young Hae about eating meat because there is such a pressure, social pressure, like we talked about. And so she slashes her wrist when he tries to shove the meat into her mouth. That's what she does afterwards. So um, she's taken into a psychiatric institute or hospital, I think, after that to get treatment. So that's what happens in the first section. So yeah, we can move on to the second section, which for me was the highlight of this novel. It's the section that I love the most, and I think is really the most symbolic, called Mongolian Mark. And is it okay if I just keep going?
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, maybe
Okay.
explain like what is the Mongolian mark, right?
Yeah, so Mongolian Mark is, I don't know how medically or biologically official this is, but it is a mark that shows that you're like pure or 100% Korean, because Koreans think that you have to be born with this spot. It's sort of like a birthmark on your backside, like on your upper buttocks, I guess. And so Korean babies are born with this, and then over time it usually disappears. You grow out of it. And so Young Hae still has her Mongolian mark, and it's unusual. And so the brother-in-law, being a filmmaker, so he's a filmmaker and he's struggling because it's very rare for a man and to be able to make money as a filmmaker, to be able to support his family as an independent filmmaker, and very much as an independent filmmaker. He's not involved in making these, you know, commercial blockbuster kinds of films. And so he becomes obsessed with Young Hae because she still has this mark supposedly, and he's found this information out from his wife. And he's been having these difficulties with his own project, which have focused on these images, like floral images on the naked bodies of people. And he's just sort of forming his vision and his ideas. And they sort of come together when he discovers that Young Hae still has this mark, because he realizes, oh, Young Hae is actually the character. She's actually the protagonist in my film. And so he becomes very obsessed with her and sort of loses control because he's married, right? He's married to Young Hae's sister, but he's also an artist, and he's a really passionate artist that can't seem to control these artistic sort of unconscious desires that are coming over him, because he has such a strong artistic vision. And so this is the moment, right? Let's see, precisely that moment he was struck by the image of the blue flower. So this is when he's actually met with her, with Young Hae, and he's convinced her to be in his film. And when he begins painting on her body, He was struck by the image of a blue flower in the woman's buttocks, its petals move opening outwards. In his mind, the fact that his sister-in-law still had a Mongolian mark became inexplicably bound up with the image of men and women having sex, their naked bodies completely covered with painted flowers. The causality linking these two things was so clear, so obvious as to be somehow beyond comprehension, and thus it became etched into his mind. Though her face was missing, the woman in his sketch was undoubtedly his sister-in-law. So there's this automatic connection between the Mongolian mark and something erotic, something sexual that he cannot control. And this is after, obviously, Young-hae is released from the hospital and she's separated from her husband. So the divorce is pending. And it's interesting how she does not refuse this. She has been refusing all of these other things, right? And yet she is very willing. She doesn't really have any hesitation or any resistance in taking her clothes off. In fact, that was one of the issues or the problems that her husband had with her, because she would just be walking around at some point naked. And so again, it might be more of a literal kind of interpretation of that, but just removing the layers, right, of yourself. And she rather enjoyed exposing her body this way. She felt like it was freeing to herself. So I'm just looking at the chats.
Yeah, a lot of members in the chat are saying they either have it
Mongolian,
or
yeah. Mm-hmm.
Someone said, Alan has said, "Oh, my sister still has a big Mongolian mark, and she's 25." Yeah, Sandara still has it.
So, like I said, the mark is stimulating something erotic, or it's stimulating a lot of the unconscious desires that the brother-in-law has, because he's repressed also. I think, most people in Korean society have a certain amount of repression. I think that it is related to Confucianism, and it's related to the decades of colonization. And so he's seeing sort of this surge in his desires, and he's becoming more conscious of the repressed desires. And again, he's not stopping them. He's letting them come to the surface as well. So he also was finding his platform. And of course, in Korean society, it's much easier for men to express, and it's easier for them to find their platform. But they do have difficulties, and you can see that in this brother-in-law character, because he has chosen a very difficult career to pursue in Korean society. Okay. So, yeah, what is the next slide? Can go to the next slide. Or Nilesh, do you want to jump in?
I just want. I mean, there were like three things that came to mind. MK, just want to add to what you said. I mean, you talked about repression, right? And I mean, again, if we blow out the book to the macro part of South Korean society now, for many years, unfortunately, South Korea has had the either number one or number two position in the number of suicide rates. Sometimes Japan has the highest suicide rate in the world. Sometimes South Korea does. So it's super high suicide rates in the world. Depression is very high in this country. And it's just recently this year that the current Yoon Suk-yeol president and his government, they have tried to implement more active measures in South Korea to deal with depression, because they see it as a big problem, affecting young people, children, teenagers, and adults, and older people as well. So, these things of suppression and repression are also connected to depression, which is a big cultural aspect, unfortunately. And I think, what you mentioned, I mean, MK, you're really drawn to this, right? This part of the book with the Mongolian mark. And I think, it's something, the Mongolian mark goes back generations, right? It's a very biological, historical part of Korean identity. And in that way, we could also interpret it as, because MK, earlier you mentioned about kind of trauma DNA being passed down, right, through generations. So in that way, we could also kind of see the Mongolian mark in this book, in this chapter, as repression, or some connection going back generation, hundreds of years. Something that has stayed with Korean people, something that has stayed with Korean women for a long time. And it's evident maybe in the Mongolian mark, but the Mongolian mark in that way is also a metaphor for certain invisible things maybe that have stayed with Korean women or Korean people through generations as well. So that's kind of the second aspect I wanted to mention. Yeah, and then I think the third thing is, like you mentioned, MK, like this freeing, right? The Mongolian mark is something that is hidden because it's on your bottom or back. People don't really see it unless you're naked somewhere, right? But now, yeah, Young-hae is revealing it, and her brother-in-law is helping her to reveal it as well. So that's important. And MK, earlier we talked about we mentioned about Young-hae being kind of a piece of art, right? And her being analyzed by her husband, brother-in-law, later her sister. And literally, in this Mongolian mark chapter, she becomes a piece of art. Her brother-in-law, I think he paints flowers on her body. First, he tells her or asks her to remove her clothes. Secondly, he paints flowers on her. So in that way, she literally becomes a piece of art. And we can interpret this part in two ways. One is we could see it as her becoming free. She can be naked. She can be free to express herself. But in a second way, we can also interpret it as a male dominating her. Right? It's a male, her brother-in-law, telling her, asking her to get naked, and then to be painted on, like some object. So it's kind of open to interpretation, I think. Is she freeing herself? Is she being dominated by a man, or do two things exist at the same time? Right?
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I think that this section really shows Young-hae for the first time enjoying something. She really loves this idea of him painting on her body, and she really loves the visual aspect. So in another way, she's finding another platform. And it is through a male character that she's able to find this. So there is still that limitation. She can't do it for herself, right? And yet she is finding that freedom, because usually a woman would keep that joy to herself in some ways if she was repressed in certain ways, right? That she wouldn't express that so fully and so obviously, like Young-hae does, even though she doesn't speak very much at all. She is celebrating her body. She's not refusing to show anything to her brother-in-law. And so I find that really interesting, that she's finding this happiness and this joy for the first time, maybe in her own body and in the celebration of the body by beautifying it, right? By drawing these flowers on it. And so again, I think that that's all really positive. Like, even though it is through a male character, it is through a male character that is going through unconventional ways that society wouldn't necessarily accept, right? He wouldn't necessarily be supported and encouraged by Korean society to be an independent filmmaker. And to be an independent filmmaker who is drawing, painting flowers on naked bodies, right? So I think that that is counterculture in its own way too, that we can read that. But it is definitely through a male character, and we have to be aware of that.
Right. I think also, like what you said, MK, like, this, her brother-in-law, the filmmaker, he's painting flowers on her body. And that is in line with her own attitude, her own goal. Because later, we find out through the book that she wants to become a plant, right? So by having natural, flowers are a sign of innocence, right? They're a sign of purity, innocence, love, and beauty.
Beauty.
And to have them painted on her body must be, I assume, quite uplifting, as it aligns with her own, desire to become a plant, right? And it's the opposite of eating meat, right?
Yeah.
And MK, what you've mentioned about the sexuality part, from reading the earlier chapter from her husband's perspective, it seems like they kind of have a bit of a dry marriage, maybe. He just talks about her being a good housewife, like cooking and ironing and preparing breakfast. And the husband mentions about her skin being a bit, not very healthy looking. And the husband doesn't seem to enjoy the physicality of Young-hae. Whereas now, her brother-in-law is showing interest in her physicality. Plus, painting flowers aligns with her own personal desire, which is freedom, right? It's a kind of freedom and escape from the suffocation she has felt of Hwabyeong.
Right.
Yeah.
So I think that going from what you said, it is really representing this platform where sexuality and the expression of one's sexuality is seen as that pathway to a potential kind of freedom, right? Whereas she's felt like, oh, I have to keep all my clothes on. I have to keep my feelings to myself. I can't express myself in this way. And I think that the focus on the Mongolian mark in his painting of these flowers, I'm not sure what the conventional ideas and responses to a Mongolian mark are, but he's really trying to beautify it, right? He's trying to see it as much more than a birthmark. And so it's almost like the Mongolian mark might be representing this kind of trauma, and he's trying to release the trauma from that mark physically, and she's really responding to that, right? And she constantly wants to be looking at these flowers and at the painting that she finds so beautiful. And that is the only way that stimulates, I think, this kind of peeling away of the layers and stimulates this conduit or this path to a kind of expression that can lead to freedom.
Right. Yeah, I think MK, with what you're saying, it's kind of through this scene with the filmmaker brother-in-law, it's an acceptance of both the dark and the light through this Mongolian mark, right? It's an acceptance of the dark and the light in humanity and within her, which is freeing itself. He's not pushing away the darkness in a way. And in that way, it kind of makes me think of South Korea's, Buddhism and Christianity are the two main religions in South Korea. I think Buddhism is still recognized as the official religion. And if we look at the symbolism of Buddhism, it's the lotus flower, right? And the lotus flower is born, its roots, its seeds are born in the dirt of the water, in the dirt of the pond. But then the stem surpasses the dirt and then becomes a flower once it surpasses the dirt. So it's about surpassing the dirt and being the innocent, the pure being that you truly are. So in that way, the lotus flower, we can tie it in that way as well, actually, to the Mongolian mark and this scene of accepting everything.
And what you said about contradiction and paradox, I think is really interesting. It's something that I see as a continuing theme that constructs meaning in this section. And it has specifically, I was going to read from this passage that has to do with the Mongolian mark. Everything was perfect. No, this is from the brother-in-law's point of view. Everything was perfect. It was just like in his sketches. His red flower closed and opened repeatedly above her Mongolian mark. He shuddered at the appalling nature of their union, a union of images that were somehow repellent and yet compellingly beautiful. Every time he closed his eyes, he could see the lower half of his body dyed green, soaked from the stomach to the thighs with a sticky grass sap. So there's this constant paradox and contradicting imagery that I think construct both meaning and desire in both of the characters. So like you said, that's what's almost required is this paradox, or both things happening at the same time, this contradiction. This scene is after they've actually had sexual intercourse, so they do eventually do that. But maybe we can go to the next slide, because there's instances of her, maybe the next one. So this is about his desire. I guess maybe it's the next one where she is so compliant. Yeah, here. So take off your clothes, he said in a low voice. This is the first time that they're about to film the painting. She was standing, staring blankly at the white poplar outside the window. The afternoon sunlight shone desolate on the white sheet. She didn't turn around. Thinking she hadn't heard him, he was on the point of repeating himself when she raised her arms and pulled her sweater up over her head. The white t-shirt she had on underneath came next, etc., etc. She wasn't wearing a bra, so she had stopped wearing these things that she felt were so confining, so restricting on her body. And so she's very compliant. She doesn't say no. She doesn't refuse to do these things, because the brother-in-law has been so hesitant to ask her to do these things, because he knows that there's a certain amount of inappropriateness, because she is his wife's sister, right?
Yeah, exactly. Oh, by the way, just to let you know, in terms of time, like we were originally planning to finish by 5:30, including like a Q&A at the end. It's 5:25 now. We do. This is the second section of our talk, and we just have one more section to talk about, which is the perspective of her sister, Inhe. So I think we're not going to finish by 5:30. It seems like more like 5:45-ish, right? Okay, if that's okay for people, or maybe even a bit later, between 5:45 p.m. and 6 p.m. Yeah, but if you need to leave, then please do so. But if you can stay, that's also great. Whoever's leaving, you can also find. Don't leave. Yeah. Also, I'm keen to add on to what you said, about this paradox and the acceptance of this paradox. It makes me think of Kim Ji-young, the other book, the modern feminist classic we briefly mentioned earlier. And there's a constant in the book and also in Korean society. Often a recurring element is Korean women feeling they need to please all the time, to be the perfect wife, to be the perfect mother, to be the perfect employee. So it's always about showing this the light side, right? Not the dark side. The men can show the totality of being a man, whether it's aggression, or the light side and the dark side. But there's not so much of that equality that generally South Korean women have. And that is portrayed through books like The Vegetarian and Kim Ji-young, born in 1982. But now, Young-hae is finally, this man, her brother-in-law, he seems to bring out and accept the totality of the dark and the light through this section, right? Yep. It's getting dark here. I'm just going to turn on my lights 1 second.
And I think that what Nilesh just said, it really points out to me that these characters are trying to understand what is unconscious. So there is an acknowledgement of what is unconscious and these unconscious desires that are very difficult to understand because they can be paradoxical and contradictory. But that's precisely why they make sense, and that's precisely why they construct meaning, is through the contradiction and paradox, I think.
And that's what brings healing at the end of the day, right? When we are accepted not just for our light side, but also for our dark side, when we are seen in our totality, actually that's when true individual healing can happen. but also family healing, community healing, and macroscopically, social healing, right? To recognize both sides, light and dark, and that's it's very important. Yeah.
For me, when I was reading the book, it was also a big contradiction between the first chapter and the second chapter, because in the first chapter, she described as very like almost like ill, sick-looking woman, very skinny, non-sexy, but and she's very ordinary. It's from the perspective of her husband, and then in the second part of the book. She suddenly becomes this object of desire from the her sister's husband, and it was really interesting contradiction, like in the sense of like of a story.
Yeah, you're totally right. And Mitch, I mean, to add on to that, I think in every society, in every culture, actually, it's the role of the artist to bring up the subconscious, right? And to show the subconscious to the masses, whether it's through painting or film or literature, etc. And here in the second chapter, it's the brother-in-law who is an artist, who is a filmmaker, who is helping to bring up this subconscious aspect.
Yeah.
And not just in Younghae, but actually within female South Koreans and Korean society itself, actually. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the contradiction that you're talking about, Mitch, which is very interesting, is largely a product of point of view.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
The way that different people can frame other people. Like the husband is just seeing her as this object that is supposed to benefit him in terms of his life, and he's seeing her in the frame of illness. And that she's crazy, right? And the brother-in-law is so different in the way that he's framing her. Although she is sort of an object also to benefit him and his film.
Yeah.
Right? He's seeing her not as crazy, but he's really validating her unconsciousness and her beauty. The way that synergizes with his unconsciousness and his ideas of beauty, which are kind of intertwined with a certain amount of ugliness too. Right? So completely different perspectives. And so that, to me, if we're talking about positive and negatives, is very positive to see a Korean man thinking differently in this way and seeing another female, although somewhat objectifyingly, he's seeing some more potential. And I think that he's trying to open up this platform for her as well, whether or not that's conscious. Because he sees that she needs that. He has some empathy and some sympathy for her that nobody else has around her. Right? And so he's saying, okay, I'm scared. I don't know what's going on. She's not saying anything, but I'm going to take a chance. I'm going to take the risk because I see something potential. I see potential. I see a possibility in this.
Exactly. Right. So that's an interesting contrast from the first chapter of the husband's POV, and then later the brother-in-law's POV. Right. Quite a change. Yeah. Is there anything else you guys want to mention about the second part regarding the brother-in-law and Mongolian mark, or would you like to move on to?
Can we go through the rest of the slides just to see if there's anything for this section?
It's the second part. It's a slide. It's the last slide of the second part.
I think that this is when he's beginning to realize what her potential is, and that she has refused to be this object of desire in her life with her husband, right? And now with these layers coming off and the synergy that is happening with her brother-in-law, something else is happening. what she had renounced was the very life that her body represented. The sunlight that came splintering through the wide window, dissolving into grains of sand, and the beauty of that body, which, though this was not visible to the eye, was also ceaselessly splintering, overwhelming. Inexpressibility of the scene beat against him like a wave breaking on the rocks, alleviating even those terrifyingly unknowable compulsions that had caused him such pain over the past year. So it's kind of foreshadowing into the plant tree transformation with the sunlight. She has this attraction to the sun on her bare skin, and he is starting to feel something from her kind of regeneration and beginning to grow into this other being, though he doesn't really understand what it is.
I also noticed how Hangang uses a lot of descriptions of physical sensations in her writing. Like in Korean, it's like something chorom, like, and for example, here is it's a sun, and I remember that part like very vividly, a very vivid part when the sister husband, after she sliced her wrist, he I think it was him who took her to the hospital, and he's talking about this his shirt soaked in her blood, and how it was wet, how it was like warm, and how he didn't throw away that shirt after that. Yeah, he kept it with him, and I think these like little details that that describe some kind of like physical sensation, or like or a visual information. It's what makes her stories very realistic, yeah, and very like relatable, yeah, because we all like can like feel or understand this physical sensations. Okay.
So what you're describing are sensory details, and
Sensory detail.
that the more writers can write with the five senses, they're attempting to stimulate the reader's five senses, right? Because as human beings, that's how we experience the world.
Yeah.
And if our senses are not stimulated, we cannot engage or understand or feel what the characters might be experiencing through their bodies and their minds, right? So it's really stimulating or encouraging a vicarious kind of experience, right? Where we can actually walk in the shoes of these characters. And I think that scene that you described about the blood on the shirt and him not, it became like his obsession, his beginning obsession with Young-hae, right? And it really the connection that he had. It's almost like this blood connection, right? Because must have touched his skin in some way. So yeah, that's a good point. The sensory details, I think Hangang is very good at it. She's very strong. And this can trigger the pathos, right? The emotional appeal. And that's really what you want to do as a writer. You want your reader to feel as much as possible through your descriptions.
Yeah.
Tatiana, do you have a question?
Yeah. Oh, the mic is still off if you're speaking.
Or you can write down the question in the chat. Okay.
I mean, while Tatiana's maybe writing or thinking about her question or comment, I think, yeah, MK and Mitch, you've raised a really good point about that. And I think also, if we think about communication, you know, for Young-hae, it seems like it's difficult to verbally communicate her depression, you know, and the pain she has inside. And, you know, I don't know about Hangang's character herself. She may be similar, and writing is her medium to release that. But for those who are repressed, and for those who find it difficult to verbally express their pain and repression, the senses can be another way. You know, so you mentioned about the blood being in the shirt, right? It's very visceral. So that's another way of communicating. That's another way of feeling, right? To feel the blood, to see the blood as well. As another medium of expressing repression or pain or oneself in any way as well. So beyond words, you know, expression can be done through physical means, right? Whether it's blood on a shirt or painting a flower on someone's body as well.
Yeah, I was just looking through because I had marked something about a reference to the vegetal and the sexual, and I read that as, yeah, speaking words, it doesn't matter to her, to Young Hae, right? This is her new form of expression. It's through the vegetal, it's through the sexual. This is the platform that she's found. It's through a physicality, it's through gesture. That has become her form of communication that is very powerful for her.
Which in a way is very kind of animalistic, right? I mean, as humans, we rely a lot on words and verbal communication, or written communication, but, you know, animals, right? And plants, nature, as far as we know, don't communicate so much in the way we do, but it's more through senses and other means of maybe more holistic communication, which ties in with her wanting to become a plant as well.
Okay, I found it. It's a little bit different from how I recalled it, but this points to another important part about the regeneration of Young Hae as a character and her desire to regenerate. And this is a reference to the Mongolian mark again. Its pale blue-green resembled that of a faint bruise, but it was clearly a Mongolian mark. It called to mind something ancient, something evolutionary, or else perhaps a mark of photosynthesis. So the way that plants are regenerating, right? And he realized to his surprise that there was nothing at all sexual about it. It was more vegetal than sexual. Okay. But of course, it's stimulating these sexual erotic desires in him. But at that moment, this is early on. This was before she's before they started filming. Before he's started painting on her body. Yeah.
So this makes me think of, if we go back to, you know, Diane's academic paper that we read on Hwabyeong and their connection to the vegetarian. You know, Diane talks about Hwabyeong being a disconnection between the mind and the body, right? And so these symptoms arising, like the lump in the chest or the throat, right? A feeling of suffocation. And, you know, what you mentioned about photosynthesis, this is actually, there's some kind of like synthesis or harmony happening in this scene of the Mongolian mark, actually, right? There's some kind of connection between the mental, the emotional, and the body that is happening in this connection between Young Hae and her brother-in-law. It seems, I think.
Do you think it's like a kind of personification where the Mongolian mark is actually like coming alive in some way?
In a way, metaphorically, yeah. But the brother-in-law is helping this aspect of nature, of the natural, come alive. Because, you know, before the brother-in-law came into the story, everything was very social and man-made, right? You know, the expectation of the husband on the wife, of her being a good housewife, is a very social, man-made construct. It's not a natural construct, right? Whereas when we come to the chapter of the brother-in-law and the Mongolian mark and the flowers and everything, they're going away from the man-made and social construct into something far more intuitive. And intuitive means to be in touch also with nature, your natural self, right? So there's something far more related to photosynthesis and her wanting to become a plant, and closer, you know, to that in this Mongolian mark section.
Yeah. And I think that's a really good point. I think something that can add to that, and maybe this can end this section, we can go to the section. And this has specifically to do with the Hwabyeong. This is after they've had sex. And this is from Younghae. This is some of her dialogue. And so now I know the face is inside my stomach, because in the dream she keeps seeing a face. She doesn't know who the face is. But this is part of what is like blocking her, right? That's occupying the inside of her. The face is inside my stomach. It rose up from inside my stomach. But let's see. But I'm not scared anymore. There's nothing to be scared of now. So it's almost like the act of sex is triggering some kind of understanding of what's inside of her body, if not beginning to release it, so that it is again a possibility of healing, right? Finding some understanding in her own repression and in her own trauma. She's not scared anymore.
Which is also linked to flowers. You know, I mean, flowers themselves are very sexual beings. You know, the fact that in the spring they bloom and they invite bees to come inside and, you know, to collect the nectar. You know, that's a very sexual act. Flowers are very sexual beings. But the fact that her brother-in-law paints flowers on her body, they engage in sex. It's an opening, and it's life. It's, you know, flowers give life, right?
Yeah.
We need flowers, we need bees,
yeah.
For the ecosystem. And again, this is relating back to nature, relating back to her wanting to be a plant, back to innocence, back to purity, back to freedom of expression, away from repression, away from depression.
Yeah. I like, Mitch, your comment. We might not ever stop talking, so we can move on to the last section because it's already 5:45.
Can we spend just a short time, like 5 minutes on the last section?
Yeah, I think.
Or not?
Yeah, I think we can do like 10 minutes on the last section, like talk about the conclusion and like maybe some conclusions, and if there is questions, we could do that for like 5 or 10 minutes more.
Sure.
This kind of situation happened last time as well when we were talking about Hwabyeong's. We were just like continuing. Okay. I had a quick question about the second part. The husband, the sister's husband, he when he first drew like flowers on her, and he made some like photos and video, and then he had an idea to have someone have sex with the Yuni, and that part was for me was kind of weird, because I mean, why he invited like another man, and then he but eventually he had engagement with her. Yeah, so
well, it's complicated, right? But initially he's asking somebody else to do it because he's married, and because he's married to his sister, right? And so it's very wrong. It's very taboo to him. So it shows that he does have a moral compass, and he is concerned about these things, right? He's hesitant. And yet the scene where the man that he's asked to do it, he refuses and he leaves, right? And so this shows, I think, the artistic vision and the passion and all of the unconscious desires that have been unleashed. He can't let it go. Like he has to bring this to fruition, right? According to his vision. And so his desire has gotten to the point where he just takes it into his own hands. And this is where we see Younghae's refusal of him, because I think she has that moral compass as well. She knows that this isn't right, and her sister is not going to like this, right? And yet she gives into it as well. It's almost like it's gone too far. And so this is what happens. And we see that it actually is positive in some ways for Young-hae because she does find this release, that it is in essence like another platform for her expression. And so she's beginning to understand what's inside of her, and she's not scared of it anymore. Right. And so we're always going to have these complexities of moral ambiguity in novels and storytelling, right? Because life is so complicated. And in those moments, it's like, what barometer do we use in terms of our choices? And oftentimes it's instinct, it's our repressed desires that are going to be the strongest indicators of what we actually do.
Yeah, I completely agree with everything you've said. And to add on to that as well, I think, her brother-in-law is a filmmaker, he's an artist. So, as a filmmaker, as an artist, his position has been to observe and represent,
exactly.
right? And that was his initial intention, to get another man to do this with Young-hae and to observe and film as an observer, as an artist. But actually, the fact that the man refused and the brother-in-law himself engages in sex with Young-hae, maybe he wasn't able to film all that at the same time and was just fully engaged in sex with Young-hae. But in a way, maybe this is also it seems like it's a release for Young-hae, but maybe it's also a release for the brother-in-law.
Oh yeah.
Maybe it's a mutual release, actually,
Yeah.
of a kind of healing for both of them. The brother-in-law no longer just observes and paints or films what he sees, but he's actually inside it. He's experiencing it himself.
He does film everything.
Oh, he does? Yeah.
He does. He sets things up, and so there's this sort of distant part of him that's functioning at the same time. So he's in the frame, but he's also the maker. He's also the creator. And so I think that does show that he's fulfilling one of his releases as well. Like, this is very crucial to him as an individual for his survival. Right.
Exactly. Yeah.
Hadn't smashed through all the boundaries. Yeah. I mean.
Yeah. So this is from Young-hae's sister's point of view.
Back in 2 minutes.
Yeah. So this is her. She walks in on the situation, actually. So it's kind of that classic way to find out that is really, in her case, kind of tragic. The truth of the matter was something she simply felt. So this is In-hae, horribly clearly. If her husband and Young-hae hadn't smashed through all the boundaries, if everything hadn't splintered apart, then perhaps she was the one who would have broken down. And if she'd let that happen, if she'd let go of the thread, she might not ever have found it again. In that case, would the blood that Young-hae had vomited today never burst from her In-hae's chest instead? So I think in this section, we see some of the positivity that has been released, or the layers released from Young-hae are then being transferred in some way to In-hae. And so this idea, if they hadn't smashed through all the boundaries, so that's what they're doing, right? They're resisting, they're kind of going against what is expected of them. And I think they're trying to break these cycles of repression and oppression to say, this is what we need to express. This is what our unconscious is like screaming for. And her sister is beginning to realize this, right? That if this didn't happen, then maybe it would have affected me more negatively, even though my life sort of fell apart in that moment that I saw them together in the bed with their bodies painted in this way. So, yeah. So this is when they're in the ambulance going, I think that Young-hae has continued to refuse to eat. And so she's at her kind of, her boundary in terms of her physicality, right? So this is when they're riding in the ambulance together, and In-hae opens her mouth. What I'm trying to say, she whispers to Young-hae. The ambulance rattles over a hollow in the road. In-hae squeezes Young-hae's shoulders. Perhaps this is all a kind of dream. She bows her head, but then, as though suddenly struck by something, she brings her mouth right up to Young-hae's ear and carries on speaking, forming the words carefully one by one. I have dreams too, you know, dreams I could not let myself dissolve into them, let them take me over. But surely the dream isn't all there is. We have to wake up at some point, don't we? Because then. So I think she's beginning to try to understand her sister and the predicament. And for me, it's sort of like she can reap, hopefully, the benefits of her understanding of Young-hae. And I'm not sure if she's the younger sister or older.
I'm not sure.
I would read this as her being the younger sister. I can't remember. But maybe she has learned something about this process, and maybe she will live her life in a different way.
Yeah. So earlier, Alex had. I mean, let's just reading this final part of the final page. Quietly, she breathes in. The trees by the side of the road are blazing, green fire undulating like the rippling flanks of a massive animal, wild and savage. Inhe stares fiercely at the trees, as if waiting for an answer, as if protesting against something. The look in her eyes is dark and insistent. So, you know, I mean, earlier, Alex, you know, one of our, you know, members, she had asked, you know, she said when she read the book, it was quite dark and a bit depressing. Is there any light in the book, right? And Alex is not with us right now. She had to leave. But to answer that question as well, like, there is light in this, depending on how you read it, but there is light in this final section from her sister's perspective. The fact that by Young-hae having this sickness or Hwabyeong, she has enabled her sister Inhe to realize that actually Inhe also has something inside of her that hasn't been released, that has been suppressed, you know. And her sister Young-hae is trying to release this suppression in her way. But I see this as hope, really, because, you know, Inhe, her sister, is realizing, actually, maybe I also have the same thing inside me, this suppression inside me. Maybe I also have Hwabyeong inside me. So even if Young-hae ends up dying, since she's not eating food, there is some hope, because if her sister Inhe realizes that she has it inside of her too, that means there's hope for other women to realize and become aware. And the first step is awareness. That's kind of 50% of the work done. And then the rest of the 50% of work is action, right? Are we going to act? You know, are we going to have a Me Too movement? Are we going to have a no corset movement? Are we going to have a 4B movement, right? So in that way, we can see this as hope in the fact that Inhe, her sister, is having her own realizations of Hwabyeong or repression as well. Right?
Yeah, so I think it's really crucial that this last section is from the sister Inhe's point of view, and that she's right next to her in the final scenes. And so we can see sort of this passing on of awareness, at least, right? There's a question in her eyes. She wants to know something. Maybe she doesn't know exactly what that question is, but she knows that there has to be something has to change, because she's experienced such trauma herself from seeing her sister deteriorate physically and so tragically. And so this is really impacting her.
So through these characters, like towards the end, like MK said, it's important that the sister is the final part in the final section of the book, because she's the female, right? She's a female South Korean, and it opens the book like what it continues, right? What is the future? This is a story of an individual. It's a story of a family, but actually we can also see it as representative of of the larger macro aspect of South Korean society and South Korean women, right? Is there hope? Is there hope for awareness and hope for action for women in South Korea?
Yeah. And I think, as we know, for the first people, the people who are revolutionary in the way that they're thinking and the way that they're acting, they're not treated so well. It's very, very difficult. And so there's a lot of sacrifice that's involved for any kind of change. And I think that this shows that inevitably there must be some sort of sacrifice.
Yeah. Exactly. And usually those who are at the beginning of some kind of revolution or change usually do more extreme things or are seen as more extreme. Also the feminist movement in South Korea has been very controversial, and it's still very controversial. But usually, there has to be some extremes in order for the dialogue, the conversation to be ignited. Yeah.
There was a question about the birds that I think is really good. I didn't notice the birds.
I haven't seen that.
But I think that that's correct, that they can symbolize some freedom if there's some consistency in each of those sections. And I think that there's a reference to the sister Inhe in the last section. She can't look at the birds anymore. So that's an interesting reference. She's in the ambulance with her dying sister, and she sees this bird flying. And again, I think it's meaning that is constructed in that paradox. Like, she's seeing the freedom, and yet she's seeing all of the isolation and the entrapment and the repression of her sister and the manifestation of that on the physical body, right? And that's really painful for her to see at the same time, so she can't look anymore. And that's when we, as the reader, I hope we are inspired in some way to make change and to find those platforms for ourselves, because usually that's a challenge in everybody's lives, right? In whatever way, whatever context we're living in.
I think at the end of the second chapter, she was, when she was in a mental hospital, her sister or her husband, I don't remember who, they found her, and she's sitting, and in her hands there's a like dead bird.
Right?
Yeah.
A dead bird?
Yeah. That she killed, I think. Yeah. And it was like really interesting detail also, because she doesn't eat meat. She also, I think, in one of her dreams, she was thinking about her breasts as very soft and like small, and very safe, and in a sense that it cannot harm anyone.
Yeah.
Like her like arm, or like
the beginning of the awareness or the realization that she can celebrate her own physical body, even though she tried to destroy herself, right? And even though what she's doing is causing her body to disintegrate, to deteriorate. So again, there's that interesting contradiction and paradox that creates all of this meaning, I think.
Okay. Very, very interesting. We could continue talking about that, I think. But unfortunately, yeah, it's been 2 hours already. So maybe let's
We can take some questions, maybe, if anybody wants to.
Questions, or if you have any, I don't know, like something to say, you could do that too. Thank you very much.
I'm also just sending something in the chat. This is a quote from Debbie Smith, the translator of The Vegetarian. It says, in all its languages, Hangangs of the Vegetarian is a work which invites a particularly personal form of reading among a particular kind of reader. Sick women who refuse to be well in a world that violates and debilitates. That was in Debbie Smith's interview a couple of days ago.
Yeah. So in the world of allopathic medicine, right, like mainstream medicine, I think most mental illness, particularly with females, is always going to be read pathologically. Like there's something wrong with the female.
Yeah.
And usually the context and the background of why and how this illness has developed is not taken into proper consideration. And so I was listening to another talk by a writer, Grace Cho, who wrote a memoir called Tastes Like War. And her mom was diagnosed with schizophrenia. And so she was trying, as her daughter, to understand this diagnosis. And once she went to some sort of alternative doctors and got their point of view on schizophrenia, and they didn't call it a mental illness. They just said, it's somebody who hears voices.
Mm.
And some people hear voices. It doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with them. It means that they're living in a society that doesn't understand when people hear other voices and doesn't accept that as something that can happen normally, right? So when she was able to look at it in that way, she looked at her mother so differently. And she put together these pieces and she said, well, she's doing this because of this. And so it was like a really cause and effect kind of impact that really led her to understand her mother much more deeply. That in there. This is another really interesting. I haven't read it, but I want to read this book now.
It sounds intriguing. Yeah. And I like the way they flipped what we commonly see as pathological into having a different perspective.
Yeah.
So it tastes like war. Did anyone have any comments or any questions about anything regarding the talk, the vegetarian or Hangang?
No.
Mhm.
I have put all the questions about this book in order in my head.
Thank you very much for this wonderful event. I really enjoyed it. I have to leave, but I will listen to the interview. Good. Thank you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank
Okay, then.
you.
First time joining. I haven't amazing time with EdHuman. Thank you. Thank you very much. As a reminder, EdHuman is a project that it's a community-based project. We create clubs for different languages, and also we have this kind of events where we talk about different stuff, interesting topics, mostly books. Yeah, mostly. Yeah, usually we talk about literature. Yeah, and I think I hope this series of lectures or discussions will become a regular thing, so we can invite MK and Nilesh more, and yeah, we will think of how to do that on a regular basis. Okay. Anything you wanna add, Nilesh and MK?
No, just thank you very much. It's been very enjoyable. I hope everyone's enjoyed it. I hope the book has made you think about things maybe from a different perspective. And if you don't have time to read The Vegetarian, then there's also the film version that you can watch
Is
as
it
well.
good? I read some reviews of that movie. They said that it was a total different thing than the book.
Yeah, the book is always better to read. Also with Kim Ji-young.
A film has to be different. It has to have its own vision because it's a totally different medium. The film isn't bad. I was surprised, but I think that you wouldn't understand a lot of things in the film if you haven't read the book, because I had read the book first.
Yeah.
And I wasn't expecting the film to be very good, but it was not bad. It was surprising. But I've tried to look for it now. It's very difficult to find because I think of the Nobel Prize. Probably locking that down, and they're going to probably charge a lot of money to see it now. Yeah, because it was just a small independent film that didn't get very much attention. But it's worth watching, I think, especially if you've read the novel.
Okay.
The novel is also quite short. It's quite an easy read. It doesn't take too much time.
Yeah, it's
Yep.
easy but heavy.
Yeah, easy but heavy. Yeah, but yeah, through the novel, it gives a good insight into just generally like South Korean culture and the
Yeah.
situation of women here as well. It's a nice metaphorical kind of thing. And thank you, Mitch, for arranging this. It's been fun.
Yes,
Yeah,
let's do it more often, more regularly. Yeah.
Sounds good.
Okay then, and thank you for joining, and let's see you next time.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank
this
you.
lecture will be on the
you.
YouTube, and we will send all the materials related to PPT, also related to the lecture, to the chat, so you can find it there.
Okay. Thank you, guys. Thank you, everyone, for joining.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. See you.
Bye.